Most people never stop to think about what it actually takes to fall asleep and wake up alive. We do it every night without thinking. We close our eyes, we drift, and we trust that morning will come. But for most of human history, that trust had to be earned. It had to be built. Because there were nights, tens of thousands of years ago, when closing your eyes without preparation meant you were not going to open them again. Imagine lying down tonight, but instead of your bedroom, you are outside. The temperature is -50 degrees Celsius. There is no heater, no insulated walls, no sleeping bag rated for Arctic conditions. Just darkness, frozen ground, and air so cold that breathing it feels like swallowing broken glass. At that temperature, the human body does not fight back dramatically. There is no sudden crisis, no alarm, no moment where you feel yourself losing. Instead, your core temperature begins to quietly drop. Your metabolism struggles to keep pace with the heat bleeding out of you in every direction. And somewhere in that slow, invisible descent, your mind goes dark. Not because something attacked you, not because anything violent happened, simply because your body ran out of the energy needed to stay alive. That is what makes cold so uniquely lethal. It does not feel like violence. It feels like rest. It feels like silence. And then it is over. And yet, Ice Age humans did this every single night. They closed their eyes in conditions that would kill an unprepared modern human within hours. They woke up. They did it again the next night. For thousands of generations. Which means they were not simply enduring the cold. They had built something. A system so carefully constructed, so precisely layered, that it continued to protect them even after they lost consciousness. Understanding how that system worked tells us something profound, not just about the past, but about what human intelligence actually is at its deepest level. The danger of extreme cold is not just about temperature. It is about imbalance. Your body produces heat constantly through metabolic processes, chemical reactions running quietly in your cells, your organs, your muscles. But your body also loses heat continuously through 4 separate physical mechanisms. Conduction, which is direct contact with cold surfaces transferring energy out of you. Convection, which is moving air physically stripping warmth away from your skin. Radiation, which is your body emitting infrared energy outward into the surrounding environment. And evaporation, which is moisture leaving your skin carrying thermal energy with it into the air. In moderate conditions, production and loss stay roughly balanced. In extreme cold, that balance collapses. Heat loss accelerates faster than your body can compensate. And during sleep, the situation becomes dramatically worse because your metabolic rate drops, your movement stops completely, and your conscious mind, the part that would normally detect danger and respond, goes entirely offline. Without the ability to react, the body enters what thermal scientists describe as a downward spiral. Temperature drops, which slows metabolism, which reduces heat production, which causes temperature to drop further. Each step makes the next step worse, faster. Here is what that means in practice. A person who falls asleep in extreme cold without the right system in place does not wake up in distress. They do not get a warning. They simply stop waking up. The spiral completes itself quietly while they are unconscious, and by morning there is nothing left to save. What Ice Age humans faced every night was not simply cold exposure. It was this feedback loop threatening to activate the moment they closed their eyes. To survive, they had to build an external system capable of maintaining thermal equilibrium for an entire night without any conscious input from the person it was protecting. That is the engineering challenge they solved. And the solution was far more sophisticated than most people realize. The first point of failure, and the one most people never think about, is the ground itself. When your body makes contact with frozen earth, heat does not just slowly drift away. It is actively pulled. Solid materials transfer thermal energy with far greater efficiency than air does, and frozen ground functions like a massive heat sink, drawing warmth out of your body through direct conduction many times faster than the surrounding air ever could. If the ground layer failed, there was no gradual warning. The body would begin losing heat faster than metabolism could replace it. Core temperature would drop, consciousness would fade, and the person lying there, comfortable, already drifting towards sleep, would not survive until morning. They would simply stop. That outcome was not theoretical for Ice Age humans. It was a lived reality, observed, learned from, and systematically prevented. They countered it by constructing layered sleeping surfaces using whatever their environment provided. Dry grass, compressed moss, and animal hides arranged beneath the body in deliberate, structured layers. The logic was not simply to add comfort or softness. The logic was to trap air, because air, not the material itself, is what resists heat transfer. Loose fibers filled with tiny pockets of still, trapped air create a thermal boundary that energy struggles to cross. By layering these materials between the body and the frozen earth, they converted a lethal surface into a controlled, insulating boundary. The ground was still frozen beneath them, but it no longer had direct access to their heat, and that distinction was the difference between waking up and not waking up. Above that ground barrier, clothing functioned as the second layer of thermal control. And the effectiveness of Ice Age garments came not from thickness alone, but from structural intelligence built into the materials themselves. Cold-adapted animals like reindeer, wolves, and Arctic foxes have fur composed of hollow or semi-hollow hair shafts, each one trapping air within its own microscopic structure. When worn as clothing, these materials create a dense network of air pockets that dramatically slow the rate at which heat escapes from the body beneath. Ice Age humans layered these garments deliberately, forming an insulation gradient where inner layers held warmth close to the skin, while outer layers acted as shields against wind and incoming moisture. But here is the critical detail that most people overlook when thinking about sleep. These garments were not removed at night. They were adjusted, tightened, and sealed. Openings were controlled, gaps were minimized, and the body was effectively enclosed within a self-contained thermal unit. If that seal was broken, if gaps were left open, if moisture penetrated the layers, the protection would degrade. And a degraded clothing system at night in extreme cold was not just uncomfortable. It was the beginning of a process that ended in death before sunrise. The clothing became the primary insulating shell for the entire sleeping body, functioning even in complete stillness, continuing to work even when the person inside it was no longer capable of adjusting anything. Even a perfectly constructed insulation system can only slow heat loss. It cannot stop it entirely. Every system leaks. Every barrier allows some energy to escape over time, and that means the human body needed to function as its own internal furnace throughout the entire night, generating enough heat continuously to compensate for what was escaping through every layer. That internal furnace runs on food, and Ice Age diets were specifically structured to provide exactly the right kind of fuel for exactly this purpose. The core of Ice Age nutrition was animal fat, not lean protein, not fast-burning carbohydrates, but dense caloric fat capable of metabolizing slowly over extended periods. A gram of fat carries more than twice the caloric energy of a gram of carbohydrate, and it releases that energy gradually over hours rather than minutes. Consuming a fat-rich meal before sleep essentially loaded the body's furnace for the entire night, ensuring a sustained, low-level metabolic burn that would continue producing heat through the darkest and coldest hours without requiring additional input. If that metabolic fuel was insufficient, insulation alone could not save the person. You can slow heat loss with the best materials available, but if the body is not generating enough heat to replace what is escaping, the temperature still drops. Slowly, quietly, and fatally. Modern physiology confirms what Ice Age humans learned through direct and often lethal experience. What you eat before sleep directly determines how much heat your body produces while you are unconscious. Without sufficient metabolic fuel, every other component of the system eventually fails, because insulation only buys time. The heat itself must be generated from within. Even with optimized insulation, and sufficient metabolic fuel, a single human body at rest produces a limited amount of thermal energy. At rest, the human body generates roughly 70 to 100 watts of heat. In negative 50 degrees Celsius, that output is often not enough to maintain thermal stability on its own against sustained heat loss through every surface simultaneously. And this created a problem that no amount of individual preparation could fully solve. In these conditions, sleeping alone was not uncomfortable. It was a death sentence. A single person, no matter how well insulated, no matter how well fed, was operating at the thermal edge. One bad variable, slightly wet clothing, a gap in the ground layer, a night colder than expected, and the individual system could not absorb that failure. There was no margin, there was no buffer, there was only the spiral. Ice Age humans solved this not with technology, but with each other. Collective sleeping was a thermal strategy as much as a social one. Multiple individuals sleeping in close proximity combined their heat output, creating a shared thermal environment warmer and more stable than any individual could sustain alone. Tightly grouped formations allow heat to accumulate within the shared airspace, retained by surrounding insulation, and by the bodies themselves acting as barriers to loss. Positioning within the group was deliberate. The most vulnerable individuals, children, the elderly, those weakened by illness or injury, were placed at the center where heat was most concentrated. Those on the outside absorbed more exposure, functioning as a living thermal buffer for everyone within. The group was not just a social unit. It was a single coordinated thermal engine, far more powerful and far more resilient than any of its individual components. Around the human cluster, the shelter functioned as a macro-level thermal regulator, and its primary function is widely misunderstood. Most people picture shelters simply as wind blockers, as barriers that keep the worst of the cold from reaching the people inside. But wind protection, while absolutely critical, is only part of what these structures accomplished. The deeper function was controlling convective heat loss at every scale. Wind does not just make you feel colder. It physically strips away the thin layer of warm air your body generates around itself, the microclimate your metabolism works constantly to maintain. Every time that layer is destroyed by moving air, your body has to regenerate it, burning additional energy in the process. In extreme cold, this is an energy cost the body cannot sustain indefinitely. By enclosing space, shelters eliminated that stripping effect entirely, allowing the group's combined heat output to accumulate rather than being continuously stolen. Ice Age shelters were typically built with low ceilings and compact interiors, reducing the volume of air that needed to be warmed and held at a survivable temperature. Materials like packed earth, large structural bones, and snow provided insulation at the macro level. Snow in particular is a remarkably effective insulator because of its high trapped air content, and a well-constructed snow shelter can maintain an interior temperature dramatically higher than the environment outside it, sometimes by 30 degrees or more. The shelter did not make the cold disappear. It reduced its intensity enough that the human system operating inside it could maintain equilibrium through the entire night, where without it, no individual system would have lasted until morning. Fire was part of the system, but not in the way most people imagine. Keeping an active fire burning through an entire night inside an enclosed shelter is not practical. It consumes oxygen steadily in an enclosed space. It demands attention from someone who needs to sleep, and it creates risks that compound in the dark. The real role of fire in Ice Age sleep survival was not continuous heating. It was preparation. It was charging the environment before sleep began. Stones and structural materials placed near fire absorb thermal energy during the warming period, a physical principle known as thermal mass. Dense materials store heat efficiently and release it slowly, over hours, long after the flames have diminished. Once the fire was reduced to managed embers, those charged stones continued releasing stored energy quietly into the sleeping space, extending the effective warm window deep into the coldest part of the night. In some cases, Heated stones were placed at specific positions within the sleeping area to maximize this radiative effect, functioning as slow-release heat sources that required no maintenance, no oxygen, and no attention. The goal was never a roaring fire through the night. The goal was to use fire as a preparatory tool that front-loaded thermal energy into the environment, then allowed stored mass to carry the warmth forward through hours when active combustion was neither possible nor safe. It was a delayed release system, engineered from stone and flame, designed to continue working long after the people who built it had fallen asleep. Of all the threats that could compromise the sleep system, moisture was among the most dangerous and the least visible. Water conducts heat approximately 25 times more efficiently than air. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 25 times. A small amount of moisture trapped within clothing or bedding does not slightly reduce insulation effectiveness. It can catastrophically accelerate heat loss, turning a carefully constructed protective layer into a direct thermal pathway that drains warmth from the body at a rate the metabolism cannot match. And moisture in an ice age sleeping system could enter from multiple directions at once. External snow or ice contacting outer layers, condensation forming where warm body air met cold outer materials, perspiration accumulating in inner layers during periods of exertion before sleep. Any of these pathways, left unmanaged, could silently degrade the system while the person inside it remained unaware. By the time the thermal effect became dangerous, consciousness might already be fading. Ice Age humans managed this threat through careful material selection and deliberate environmental control. Animal skins treated with natural oils provided resistance to external moisture, while still allowing internal vapor to migrate outward rather than accumulate. Sleeping areas were chosen or prepared to remain dry, elevated where possible above ground moisture, and arranged to prevent condensation from building near the skin. Layer structure was designed so that moisture produced by the body moved outward through the system rather than saturating the insulation closest to the skin. Maintaining dryness was not a comfort preference. It was a structural requirement. A wet system failed fast, and in -50 degrees Celsius, a fast failure meant the person inside it did not see morning. Here is what becomes clear when you look at all of this together. None of these elements function adequately in isolation. They are not independent solutions that happen to coexist. They are interdependent components of a single integrated system, and every one of them depends on the others to perform its role correctly. Remove ground insulation, and heat drains downward through conduction faster than metabolism can replace it. The person grows cold from below while sleeping, unaware, unable to respond. Remove structured clothing, and insulation fails at the body level, and the body's own heat output bleeds directly into the surrounding air. Remove sufficient metabolic fuel, and heat production drops below the threshold needed to compensate for ongoing losses, and the thermal spiral begins. Remove group sleeping, and thermal output becomes insufficient for the conditions, and the individual system operates with no margin for error, no buffer against a single unexpected variable. Remove the shelter, and wind strips warmth faster than any internal system can accumulate it. Remove moisture control, and the insulation itself becomes the threat, pulling heat away faster than the bare body would lose it in open air. Fail any single one of these components, and the others are placed under stress they cannot fully compensate for. The system survives only when everything functions together, simultaneously, continuously, without interruption. And during sleep, there is no one awake to notice a failure beginning. There is no opportunity to adjust, to correct, to respond. If any one of these components failed in the night, there would be no correction before morning. Whatever had been built had to function correctly from the moment consciousness faded until it returned. That was the standard, every night, across thousands of generations, and the standard was met. What this system reveals goes far beyond survival technique. It reveals a specific and sophisticated form of cognition operating tens of thousands of years before anything we traditionally call civilization. Ice Age humans had to act in anticipation of conditions that had not yet occurred. They gathered materials before the temperature dropped. They consumed specific foods not because they were immediately hungry, but because they understood, through accumulated experience, the precise connection between eating now and staying warm hours later. They arranged sleeping formations based on a mental model of how heat moved through space, where it accumulated, and where it was lost. This is delayed response thinking, the ability to project forward in time, to construct a model of a future state, and to take deliberate action in the present based on predicted outcomes that will not be visible until hours later. That is not instinct. Instinct does not build layered ground insulation. Instinct does not position the most vulnerable individuals at the thermal center of a sleeping cluster. Instinct does not select hollow hair animal skins for their microscopic air-trapping properties. These are the products of structured knowledge, refined through direct experience, tested against lethal consequences, and transmitted across generations through demonstration, repetition, and memory. These were not abstract scientists theorizing about thermodynamics and safety. They were people who had watched others fail, who had seen what happened when a single component of the system was missing or wrong, who carried that knowledge as the most important knowledge they possessed. Because in their world, it was. And they built a framework durable enough to survive not just one generation, but hundreds, passed forward through some of the most extreme conditions human beings have ever faced and survived. So when you picture a human being lying down on frozen ground 50,000 years ago, do not picture helplessness. Do not picture luck. Picture a system under test. Because sleep is the ultimate test of any survival structure. It removes the operator from the equation entirely. Whatever has been built must run without supervision, without adjustment, without any intervention at all. If it fails, there is no correction before morning, no second attempt, no warning, just the spiral, completing itself in the dark. And yet they succeeded. Not because they were immune to the cold, not because they were physically stronger or biologically different from us, but because they built something that continued to work even when they could not. They built something that outlasted their own consciousness every single night for tens of thousands of years. A system designed not to be heroic, but to be reliable, not to fight the cold, but to reorganize the environment so completely that the cold could not reach them while they slept. They did not survive by overpowering their environment. They survived by understanding it deeply enough to redesign it. And that is the part of the story worth carrying forward. Human survival was never purely about strength or speed or aggression. It was always, at its foundation, about the ability to build systems that outlast any single person's capacity to maintain them. Systems that keep working in the silence. Systems that hold while we sleep. The cold did not break them. The system held. If this kind of thinking interests you, the hidden engineering behind human survival across deep time, consider following Prehistoric Shadows. Because the past is not just something we study, it is something we can still learn from.